Towards the end of September, Humboldt and Bonpland bade Bogota adieu and started for Quito. Out of the two roads for which they might have taken, like true naturalists, they chose the worst. The roads from Bogota and Fusagastia, and thence to Iconozo, was one of the most difficult and least frequented in the Cordilleras. The traveler, Humboldt afterwards wrote, must feel a passionate enthusiasm for the beauties of nature, who refers to the dangerous descent of the desert of San Fernando and the mountains of Huasaguara, leading towards the natural bridges of Iconozo, to the unusual road by the Mesa de Juan Diaz to the banks of the Magdalena. Journeying 2 days in a southeasterly direction, they came to Iconozo, a ruined town of the Miosco Indians. It lay at the northern end of the valley of the same name. The rocks of this valley seem to have been carved by the hands of man. Their naked and barren summits presented a picturesque contrast to the tufts of trees and shrubs which covered the brinks of deep crevice in the center of the valley. Though this valley ran a small torrent called the Rio de la Suma Paz, to this torrent the travelers came, nor could they have crossed it without great difficulty, had they not nature provided two bridges of rocks, like the natural bridge in Virginia. The highest of these bridges was 46 feet in length and nearly 40 in breadth. Its thickness in the center was about 7 feet. Humboldt experimented on its height and found it 312 feet above the level of the torrents. For the safety of travelers, the Indians of the valley had formed a small balustrade of reeds extending along the precipice road leading to the other bridge. 60 feet below the bridge was another, to which the travelers were led by a narrow pathway descending along the brink of the crevice. In the middle of the second bridge was a hollow of more than 24 feet square. Though this which they perceived the bottom of the abyss, the torrent seemed to flow through with a dark cavern, from which there arose a melancholy noise caused by the numerous flights of nocturnal birds that haunted the crevice. Humboldt at first mistook them for bats of gigantic size. Thousands of them were seen flying over the surface of the water. The Indians assured him that these birds were of the size of a fowl, which a curved beak and an owl's eye, they were called cacas. It was impossible to catch them on account of the depth of the valley, and they could be examined only by throwing down rocks to illuminate the sides of the crevice. Leaving the birds of Iconozo, the travelers pursued their journey until they came to the mountain of Quindiu. At the entrance of this mountain near Abacu, they saw the truncated cone of Zolima, covered with perpetual snow. The little river of Combinia wound along a narrow valley and forced its way through a thicket of palm trees. The mountain of Quindiu was considered the most difficult passage in the Cordilleras of the Andes. It was a thick, uninhabited forest, which, in the finest season, could not be traversed in less than 10 or 12 days. Not even a hut was to be seen, nor could any means of subsistence be found. Travelers at all times of the year furnished themselves with a month's of provision, since it often happened that by melting of the snow and the sudden swell of the torrents, they found themselves so circumcised that they could descend neither on the side of the Carthago nor that of the Ibeg. The highest point of the road, the Guardo del Paramo, was 1,450 feet above the level of the sea. As the foot of the mountain towards the banks of the Quaca was only 3,140 feet, the climate there was in general mild and temperate. The pathway which formed the passage of the Cordilleras was only about a foot in breadth, and had the appearance in several places of a gallery dug and left open to the sky. In this part of the Andes, the rock was covered with a thick stratum of clay. The streamlets which flowed down the mountains had hollowed out willies 18 or 20 feet deep. Along these crevices were full of mud. The travelers were forced to grope their passage, the darkness of which was increased by the thick vegetation that covered the opening above. The oxen, which were the beasts of burden commonly made use of in this country, could scarcely make their way through these galleries, some of which were 2,000 yards in length. If a traveler had not met them in one of these passages, they could not have avoided them, but by turning back and climbing the earthen wall, which bordered the crevice, and keeping themselves suspended by laying hold of the roots which penetrated to this depth from the surface of the ground. They followed the mountains of Quindu in October on foot, followed by 12 oxen, which carried their collections and instruments amidst a deluge of rain to which they were exposed during the last 3 or 4 days in their descent on the western side of the Cordilleras. The road passed through a country full of bogs and covered with bamboos. Their shoes were sore torn by the prickles which oozed out from the roots of these gigantic gramina, that they were forced, like all other travelers who just liked being carried on the men's backs, to go barefooted. This circumstance, the continued humidity, the length of the passage, the muscular force required to tread in a thick and muddy clay, and the necessity of fording deep torrents of icy water, rendered this journey extremely fatiguing. But, however painful it was accompanied by none of those dangers with which the credulity of the people armed travelers. The road was narrow, but the place where it skirted precipice was very rare. As the oxen were accustomed to put their feet in the same tracks, they formed small furrows across the road, separated from each other by narrow ridges of earth. In the very rainy seasons, these ridges were covered with water, which rendered the steps of the travelers doubtfully uncertain, since they knew not whether they placed their feet on the ridge or in the furrow. The usual mode of traveling for persons in earlier circumstances was in a chair strapped to the back of one of the native porters, who lived by letting out their back and loins to travelers. They talked in this country of going on a man's back, as we mentioned, going on horseback. No humiliating idea was annexed to the trade of the porters. And the men who followed that occupation were not Indians, but mulattoes, and sometimes even whites. It was curious to hear these men, with scarcely any covering, quarreling in the midst of the forest because one had refused the other, who pretended to have a whiter skin, the pompous title of Don, or Su Mesed. The usual load of a porter was 6 or 7 arrobas. Those who were very strong carried as much as 9 arrobas, which we reflect on the enormous fatigue to which these miserable men were exposed, journeying 8 or 9 hours a day over mountainous country, when we know that their backs were sometimes as raw as those of beasts of burden, that travelers had often the cruelty to leave them in the forest where they fell sick, that they earned by a journey from Ibeg to Cartago only 12 or 14 piasters in from 15 to 25 days. We are at a loss to conceive how this employment of a porter was so eagerly embraced by all robust young men who lived at the foot of the mountains. The taste for a wandering life, the idea of certain independence amid forests led them to prefer it to the sedentary and monotonous labor of cities. Passage of the mountains of Quindia was not the only passage of the mountains of that part of South America. The whole of the province of Antioquia was surrounded by mountains so difficult to pass that these who disliked entrusting themselves to the skill of a bearer were not strong enough to travel on foot from Santa Fe de Antioquia to Boca de Neres or Rio Samana. Relinquish all thoughts of leaving the country. Humboldt had acquainted with an inhabitant of this province so immensely bulky that they had not met with more than 2 mulattoes capable of carrying him, and it would have been impossible for him to have returned home if those 2 carriers had died while he was on the banks of Magdalena, at Mompox, or at Honda. The number of young men who undertook the employment of beasts of burden at Choco, Ibeg, and Mandolin was so considerable that travelers sometimes met a file of 50 or 60. A few years later, when a project was forced to make the passage from Neres to Antioquia passable for mules, the porters presented formal remonstrations against mending the road, and the government yielded to their clamors. The person carried in a chair by a porter was compelled to remain several hours motionless and leaning backwards. The least motion was sufficient to throw him down, and his fall was so the more dangerous as the porter, confident in his own skill, generally chose the most rapid declivities or crossed a torrent on a narrow and slippery trunk of a tree. These accidents were, however, rare, and those which happened were attributed to the imprudence of travelers who, frightened by a false step at the porters, leaped down from their chairs. At Abeg, before the porters started on their journey across Quindian, they plucked their on the neighboring mountain several hundred leaves of viajo, a plant of the family of bananas. These leaves were 20 inches long and 14 inches broad. Their lower surface was covered with precious substance which fell off in scales. This particular varnish enabled them to resist rain for a long time. Of these leaves, which they were plentifully supplied on their journey, the porters made a roof. 100 weight was sufficient to cover a hut large enough to hold 6 or 8 persons, which Humboldt and Bonpland stopped for the night in Quindio. They picked out a spot in the forest where the ground was dry, and the porters loped from the trees a few branches and made tents. dividing the timber work into squares by stalks of some climbing plants that grew near, or perhaps by the threads of the agave. They were spread over this framework, their viaggio leaves, the stems of which were notched so as to hang overlapping row like the tiles of a house. The travelers found themselves extemporized houses, cool and commodious. If they felt the rain during the night, they had only to point out the spots which it dropped upon them. A single leaf would mend it.